Welcome to the show called Let's Visit Mackinac City, Michigan. Mackinac City, Michigan is located in the northern part of Michigan. It is the last city in lower Michigan before one travels to the upper peninsula to St. Ignace. Mackinac City is located in Sheboygan County with today's population of about 809 people. Mackinac City was founded by the French fur trader Jean Nicole. Nicole founded this area around 1715. The fur trader was also known as the man who carried two thunders. On today's show, we are going to be sharing some actual video footage about Mackinac City, Michigan. So, pour yourself a nice warm cup of coffee and sit right back down in your easy chair, relax, and enjoy the show.
So all you folks from Michigan, or where are you from?
Michigan.
All right.
Yeah, I'm from Kalamazoo. Kalamazoo, yep.
Does this slow down a little bit now?
Oh, way down.
Yeah.
Way down. Just about ending, actually.
End of the season, right?
Very definitely.
Yeah, I think today's Columbus Day too. Is it a federal holiday?
That's Columbus Huron is on the right. This is all Lake Huron here, but more specifically, it's called the Straits of Mackinac. The Straits of Mackinac has 3 islands out there. Mackinac Island's on the left. Next to it is Round Island. Then there's a longer island out there called Bois Blanc. That island is accessible by car ferry from the town of Sheboygan. That town's about 15 miles away. But it's pretty much wilderness. It's great for deer hunting, but not much in the way of tourism goes on there. When you go across the bridge, you're in the upper peninsula of Michigan, not Canada. And if you go 50 miles beyond the bridge, you're in a place called Sault Ste. Marie. Sault Ste. Marie is the oldest city in Michigan. It was founded about 48 years after the Pilgrims landed. It was a very old city. It's also the home of the Sioux Locks. The locks are where the level of Lake Superior is stepped down 22 feet to be at the level of Lake Huron. Ships go into the locks, they go down 22 feet, they go down the St. Mary's River and into Lake Huron and vice versa. The lower peninsula of Michigan is shaped like a mitten, and we're at the very top of that mitten. It's called being at the tip of the mitt. Our first point of interest is this fishing pier here, and the state of Michigan spent thousands of dollars to build this pier. And I come around here 3 or 4 times a day, 7 days a week, all summer long. I've never seen anyone catch a fish here. Fortunately, it does have other uses, and its primary other use is that on the 4th of July, they use this pier as a place to ignite fireworks. And island ferries load up with passengers, they anchor out there at a safe distance, and people are able to watch fireworks from aboard those ferries. Also, folks that rent motel rooms on the water can view fireworks from the balconies of their hotels and beaches, so it's kind of a neat time to be here. It's a beautiful place to come for a walk in the morning or evening, but I definitely would not bring a fishing pole. They put pictures of fish here to fool people. They don't like me saying that either. But it's true. Don't get me wrong, there are fish out there. They're just not around that pier for some reason. Since the invention of the automobile, they've had problems getting cars from the lower peninsula to the upper peninsula. And the way they did it originally was they loaded them on flatbed railroad cars. Then they put those railroad cars under railroad ferries, and they used to operate where that icebreaker is docked right now. And but it cost about $40 a car, and that was a lot of money in those days. So in 1923, the state of Michigan built an automobile ferry system that was located where these buildings are on our right. And between 1923 and 1957, when the bridge was completed, 12 million cars had passed over the Straits of Mackinac on that car ferry system. In that period of time, they used 9 different ferries. In 1928, they bought a ferry that had a 45-car capacity, and they wanted to increase its capacity, so they sent it back to the factory to add a second deck to it. The only problem is they didn't have a way of getting cars onto that second deck, so they had to build that tall building there, which was an elevator for cars. Obviously, they had to have It served here between 52 and 57 because the bridge was completed in 57, and that was a pretty short time. After it served here, it served in the St. Lawrence Seaway, then in British Columbia. In 1987, it was sold to China. As it was being towed to China, 100 miles off the coast of Oregon, it ran into a serious storm and sank in 1,400 feet of water. There used to be times when people had to wait in lines here as long as 24 hours. Lines that stretched from here all the way to the next town of Sheboygan, 15 miles away. I don't know about you, but I get impatient waiting in Walmart. 24 hours is a long time to wait. And on November 1st of 1957, the very same day the bridge opened, this very system was shut down. On our right is the icebreaker Mackinac. That icebreaker was commissioned in 1944 as part of the war effort to keep war materials flowing to the Great Lakes. It was decommissioned in 2006 primarily because they could no longer get parts for it, and they also wanted to reduce the size of the crew. The way the ship worked was that it had a large bow propeller, a forward propeller, that propelled the ship on top of the ice. And then once it was on top of the ice, it had what was called a ballast shifting system, where thousands of gallons of water was shifted back and forth in the hull of the ship every 90 seconds. And that rushing water back and forth inside of the ship, side to side in the ship, caused the ship to rock back and forth on top of the ice. And that rocking motion caused it to crush through the ice. This icebreaker is broken ice as thick as 18 feet. That's like from the ground to the top of that building just ahead of us. Very thick ice. And it's now a museum ship, and you can go on board and take tours of it. There's a greeter on board to help you get started on your tour. They have experts stationed in places like the engine room and chart room. And these are folks that actually served on board the icebreaker while it was an active ship stationed in the town of Sheboygan, so they know what they're talking about. With the greeter on board as well, you take your picture on board with your camera, so you got souvenir photos, and there's a ship store on board where you can purchase souvenirs. I'm going to tell you a quick personal story about something that happened to me on board that ship. Back in 2012, I was dating a lady that was on the committee that got this to become a museum ship in the first place, and she also served on board as a volunteer greeter. And folks that work on board the ship are able to go on board on 4th of July and view fireworks from the deck of the ship that are ignited from that fishing pier we looked at. Well, she called me and asked me if I'd like to go over with her and watch fireworks, and I said yes. So we got some lawn chairs, we set them up on the deck of the ship aimed at that fishing pier, and it was a perfectly beautiful evening, nice and warm and clear skies, beautiful. And the fireworks were literally the best I'd ever seen in my life, and I held her hand all the way through it. After they were over with, we looked off to the east at the horizon. By this time it was dark out, and we saw the moon coming up on the horizon as if it were coming up out of the water, only it was bright red. Anyway, it was such a romantic setting that night that I managed to kiss her aboard the ship that night for the very first time, and we got married 6 months later during the worst blizzard of the year. Anyway, she said, it must be an omen, we're not supposed to get married, and I said, the good Lord's just testing our resolve. Are you all familiar with the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a 3-story restaurant here, where those structures are. This is a ticket office for the icebreaker. The bow propeller has a focus right here on its foot. I don't know if you folks have ever heard of the Dixie Highway, but the Dixie Highway system started in Miami, Florida way back in 1917. It came up both coasts of Florida, wound its way up through the southern states up into Ohio and Indiana. Then it came into Michigan as Highway 31 along Michigan's western coastline, Highway 23 along Michigan's eastern coastline, and those two highways used to join together right where this clock is in front of us, right here. And that's why they call this building the Dixie Saloon. It was built at the end of the Dixie Highway. The Dixie Saloon has a very colorful history, and we're going to stop and talk about that colorful history and do a little bit more advertising. That's the last picture. It's called the Mercy A House. Turns out it was a house of ill repute for years and years. I don't know how they got away with it, but apparently they did. Then in 1917, some folks bought the building and they changed it into a different business, a business called the Dixie Tavern, also named after the Dixie Highway. And they were in business from 1917 all the way up until 1982. Well, the colorful thing happened during the days of Prohibition. During the days of Prohibition, Michigan was divided into two halves, the eastern half and western half. The western half was controlled by Al Capone and his gang. The eastern half was controlled by a gang called the Purple Gang. They were the Bernsteins out of Detroit. And they had an agreement with the Capone gang that they would supply them with alcohol that they smuggled in from Canada. In the town of Sheboygan, there's a restaurant called the Boathouse. And its history is that during the days of Prohibition, it was an actual boathouse owned by members of the Purple Gang. And they used to bring in alcohol to that point, and there they would relabel it. It came in as Canadian Club whiskey, went out as Old Log Cabin whiskey. And they would bring it here to the Dixie Tavern to turn over to the Capone Gang. Now I asked myself, why in the world would they bother doing that? But if you get a map of Michigan and divide it straight down the middle, you'll find this is dead center in the middle of the state. And those guys were extremely territorial. And this would have been a neutral place for them to make that exchange, so it makes perfect sense. Another colorful thing happened here in 1984. A gentleman named Ben Rozak bought the building. He changed it into the only seasonal McDonald's in the world. And it was very nice when you could sit here and eat hamburgers and view the Straits of Mackinac. These tents and buildings weren't there then, so we had a clear view of the Straits of Mackinac. After about 10 years, Mr. Rozak sold it to the folks that own it now. The folks that own it now have changed it into, hands down, the most popular restaurant in town. It's one of the few businesses that stays open here all year long. And their claim to fame are steaks and ribs, but they also have a wide and varied menu besides that. O'Reilly's, which joins, it's literally part of the same restaurant. They use the same kitchen. They have a little bit different menu reflecting the name O'Reilly's, but it's more an Irish pub than a real restaurant. Both places have excellent food and excellent service. They tend to get very loud after the dinner hour. They crank the music way loud. And so if you don't like that kind of thing, go there during the day. During the day, they're sort of like Applebee's. Well, that's our last advertising. I know that'll make you sad. There's a gentleman in town named Jerry Pryor, and Jerry's a wood carver, and he's carved all the wooden statues you're going to see in the park. And I spoke to Jerry about this one that we're going to stop and look at, and he told me how it came to be. He said he was just driving along, he spotted a large white pine log lying in a ditch, and he said he visualized this Indian in that log. So he went to the village government, asked them if he could stand that log here and carve this Indian right here on the spot, and they said yes. He worked on it for an entire summer. Because of the shadow, you can't really appreciate the detail of it, so I'm going to let you off the trolley for a minute. Take a look at it. Indian chief, and he became famous by saving the life of a man named Alexander Henry. Alexander Henry was a fur trader who had come to this area from the New Jersey colony, and he came here to be involved in the French and Indian fur trade. The only problem is he came during the French and Indian War, and the French and Indian French and Indians here were at war with the British, and he was British as he showed up, so he literally showed up in enemy territory. He found himself surrounded by 60 braves with a knife in one hand, tomahawk in the other, and they were literally ready to kill him. But there was a different chief among them that saw something in him that he liked and admired, so he allowed him to live. That wasn't this Indian chief. This Indian chief, when he was a young man, had a vision that he would one day make a blood brother out of an Englishman, and so he did. He made a blood brother out of Alexander Henry. And it turns out to be a great thing that he did, because he ended up saving Alexander Henry's life over and over and over again. And it's a good thing that Alexander Henry's life was saved, because later on in his life he introduced a man named John Jacob Astor in the fur business. John Jacob Astor started several fur companies. Among them was the Pacific Fur Company. Well, the Pacific Fur Company started the first U.S. town on the West Coast, which is Astoria, Oregon. He also sponsored a group of fur traders to go from St. Louis, Missouri out to Astoria, and the path that they took became the Oregon Trail. Later in his life, John Jacob Astor relocated to New York City and became heavily involved in real estate and became the first multimillionaire in the United States. And he was an immigrant from a place called Waldorf, Germany. You put Waldorf and Astoria together, you come up with a very famous hotel, the Waldorf Astoria. But he didn't build it, his great-grandson did. John Jacob Astor IV built the Waldorf Astoria, and he's also the John Jacob Astor who was killed on the Titanic. But if it hadn't been for this Indian chief saving the life of Alexander Henry, he wouldn't have been around to introduce John Jacob Astor into the fur business in the first place. Also indicates that this Indian had something to do with the thousands and thousands of people that migrated westward on the Oregon Trail to Oregon by covered wagon. We're going to turn into the old Mackinac Point Lighthouse. This is the most visited lighthouse in Michigan. It has a very interesting history, and the way the light work is interesting, so we're going to stop and talk about this. After we talk about it, I'm going to let you off the trolley so you can walk around it. At the base of those towers are what are called caissons. Caissons were giant concrete forms. They were 40 stories high, they were built on dry ground, and they were welded together. And one of the welders working in that particular part of the project was at the very top of one of them and lost his footing and fell 40 stories to his death. When he went to put those caissons, those foundation pieces, on the bedrock of the lake, they had to be in a perfectly straight line, and they used divers for that alignment of them. And one of the divers came up too fast and died from the bends. The final gentleman was just on a working platform about 5 feet above the water, but he was close to the water's edge when he had a heart attack, fell into the water, and died by drowning. Now again, we don't talk about that to be morbid, but there's a... So as you look at it, see if you can pick out different things like nuts and bolts and rivets. There's a plaque on the left listing the gentlemen's names who were killed, and there are bricks inscribed with the workers who worked on the bridge, 500 workers, on the bricks surrounding the wall there. And they set up bleachers and chairs here and hold their memorial service right there. Several times a week somebody asks me, why is Mackinac City spelled with a W and Mackinac Island spelled with a C? Well, we're going to talk about this sign right here, and that leads into that. The sign says, welcome to, what is that word? Michilimackinac. And I went to the Upper Peninsula to an Indian museum to do some research on that word. And the gentleman there told me that the early Indians of this area believed in the Great Flood, like the flood story in the Bible. But they believed that Mackinac Island was the first place that dry land appeared, as those waters receded, and they believed that it appeared in the form of a giant turtle or great turtle. The Indian word for the great turtle was Michilimackinac. And but because the area was dominated by the French were the ones that put that Indian word into writing, and they're the ones that rather confused everyone by putting a C at the end of it. That C should always be pronounced as if it were a W. When Mackinac City was established, it was established by English people, and they wanted to have an English version of their word, so they dropped the C.
now travel on the Mackinac Bridge across and back to Mackinac City. So continue enjoying that warm cup of coffee, relax, and enjoy.